Smile. And try not to talk too much. The words landed flat on the table like a bill no one wanted to pick up, and for a second, even the low hum of the restaurant seemed to hesitate. Naomi Brooks stood there with a glass pitcher still in her hand, condensation slipping down her fingers, her reflection faint in the polished metal tray beside her, and she didn't move right away, didn't nod, didn't smile, just looked at him, really looked, as if she were measuring something deeper than the tailored navy suit or the expensive watch. Catching the soft amber light, Ethan Cole didn't look up at first, his eyes scanning his phone, thumb moving with precise, controlled motions, the kind of movements that suggested a man who made decisions worth millions before finishing his morning coffee. And when he finally did lift his gaze, it was quick, clinical, like checking a detail off a list, not a person. It's simple, he added, tone even, almost bored, as if the outcome was already decided. I need someone to sit with me tonight. Smile when appropriate, and leave when it's over. Naomi set the pitcher down slowly, the glass making a soft, clean sound against the table, and around them, silverware chimed, low conversations floated between tables, a muted jazz track curled through the air, but at their corner, everything felt narrower, tighter, like the space had drawn in around the exchange. What if I don't? She asked, her voice calm, not loud, but steady enough to cut through the layers of quiet noise. And that made him pause, just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough that his thumb stopped moving. He studied her then, properly this time, taking in the pressed black uniform, the name tag pinned just a little crooked, the tiredness around her eyes that didn't quite hide the sharpness behind them, and something in his expression shifted, not softened, not yet, just recalibrated. Then I find someone else, he said, simple, direct. But there was a fraction of a second where the certainty in his voice thinned, like a crack you could only see. If you were looking for it. Naomi reached for the tray again, adjusting it against her hip, her fingers brushing the cool metal, grounding herself in something physical, something real, and she noticed then the way his shoulders were set too tight for someone sitting down, the way his jaw held just a little too firm, like he was bracing against something invisible. You don't need a date, she said quietly, more to the space between them than to him. You need someone to believe you're not alone. And for the first time, Ethan didn't respond immediately. The words hung there, light but weighty, and the overhead lights caught in the glassware, scattering reflections across the table like fragments of something unspoken. He leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, a controlled release. And for a moment, the cold precision slipped just enough to reveal something else underneath. Fatigue, maybe, or something closer to isolation, something he had learned to dress in silence and structure. 8 p.m., he said finally, sliding a card across the table without breaking eye contact this time. Just be there. And Naomi looked down at the card, then back at him, her reflection flickering again in the tray's surface, and this time, she didn't answer right away, because somewhere between the quiet clink of glasses and the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat, she realized this wasn't just a job offer, and whatever this man thought he was buying, it wasn't going to stay simple for long. By the time the dinner rush softened into a low, steady hum, the card was still in Naomi's apron pocket, pressed flat against the fabric like it had weight far beyond paper, and every time she moved, every time she reached for a plate or refilled a glass, she felt it there, quiet but present, like a decision waiting for her to catch up. The clock above the service station ticked toward 7:30, each second sharp against the stainless steel walls, and the scent of lemon cleaner mixed with roasted garlic lingered in the air, familiar, grounding, a reminder of where she belonged, or at least where she had learned to stand without being noticed. You are still here? Her coworker Lila asked, tying her apron looser as she clocked out, her voice light but curious, eyes flicking toward Naomi's still full section, and Naomi nodded without looking up, wiping down a table slowly, deliberately, as if the extra seconds might give her clarity. Just finishing up, she said, though the truth sat heavier than the words, because she had already finished, had been finished for the last 10 minutes. But leaving meant choosing, and choosing meant stepping into something she could not fully see. Across the room, the last of the guests filtered out, heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor, coats sliding on, conversations fading into the cold night beyond the glass doors, And when the manager finally dimmed the lights by a fraction, the space shifted, less performance, more silence. Naomi slipped into the back hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead, casting everything in a pale, unforgiving glow, and she reached into her pocket, pulling the card out for the first time since he had handed it to her. Her name tag catching briefly on the edge as it slid free. Ethan Cole, embossed in clean black letters, the kind of card that did not need explanation, and beneath it, an address she recognized, not because she had been there, but because everyone in the city knew it. The kind of place where decisions were made behind closed doors and people, like her, only entered through service entrances. She turned the card over once, then again, her thumb tracing the edge, thinking of the way he had looked at her, not dismissive exactly, but not seeing either, like she was a solution, not a person. And yet there had been that pause, that brief crack, where something else had shone through, something uncertain, something human. You going or not? Lila's voice came again from down the hall, softer now, not teasing, just real, and Naomi glanced up, meeting her eyes for a second before looking back at the card. I do not know, she admitted, and it surprised her how honest it sounded, how it settled into the air without apology. Outside, the night had cooled, a crisp bite in the air as she stepped through the back door. The city stretching out in familiar lines of streetlights and passing cars, the distant sound of a train horn echoing somewhere beyond the buildings, and she stood there for a moment, breathing in, letting the cold steady her thoughts. She could go home, change into something simple, forget the card existed, return tomorrow, and be exactly who she had been this morning, unseen, predictable, safe. Or she could step into a room where every eye would measure her, where every word would matter, where she would be standing beside a man who had asked her to be quiet, to be small, to fit into a version of herself that was easier for him to manage. Naomi exhaled slowly, the breath visible in the cold air, and then she moved, not quickly, not hesitantly, just forward, pulling her coat tighter as she walked toward the bus stop, the card still in her hand now instead of her pocket. Because if she was going to show up, she was not going to disappear, and somewhere between the sound of her footsteps on the pavement and the steady rhythm of her heartbeat, the decision settled into something clear, something firm, something that did not ask for permission. The bus ride was quiet in the way only late evenings in the city could be, a low mechanical hum beneath flickering overhead lights, the windows reflecting faint outlines of tired faces and passing street lamps. And Naomi sat near the back, her coat folded tightly around her, the card still resting between her fingers, as if letting go of it might undo the decision she had already made. Each stop came and went with a soft hiss of doors opening and closing, people stepping off into their own lives. And with every block, the buildings outside shifted, growing taller, cleaner, more distant from the narrow streets she knew, until the bus finally slowed near a corner lined with polished stone and quiet security presence, the kind that did not need to speak to be understood. She stepped off, the cold air sharper here, cleaner somehow, and for a moment she just stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the building in front of her, its glass facade catching the city lights like a mirror too perfect to belong to the same world she had left behind less than an hour ago. The address on the card matched, precise and undeniable, and as she approached, her shoes sounded different against the pavement, softer, almost cautious, as if the ground itself expected something from her. Inside, the lobby stretched wide and quiet, marble floors reflecting a muted glow from recessed lighting, the air carrying a faint scent of polished wood and something expensive she could not quite name, and behind a sleek desk, a man in a tailored suit glanced up, his eyes moving quickly over her before settling into a polite but measured expression. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone professional, but there was a slight pause before the words, just enough to suggest he was deciding how to place her. Naomi held the card out without hesitation, her hand steady, and his gaze shifted to it, recognition flickering almost instantly. "Of course," he said, the shift in his posture immediate, subtle but clear, and he gestured toward the elevators with a small nod. 27th floor. They are expecting you." And for a second, Naomi caught her own reflection in the polished metal of the elevator doors as they opened, her uniform replaced now with a simple black dress she had changed into at home. Nothing extravagant, but clean, fitted, chosen carefully, and she noticed the way she held her shoulders, not stiff, not small, just present. The elevator ride felt longer than it should have, the quiet hum enclosing her thoughts as the numbers climbed one by one, and when the doors finally opened, the space beyond was different again, warmer in tone but heavier in expectation. Voices drifting from deeper inside, low and controlled, like conversations that mattered. She stepped out, the soft carpet muting her footsteps, and a woman approached almost immediately, her smile practiced but not unkind, eyes sharp with quiet assessment. "You must be Naomi," she said, extending a hand, and Naomi nodded, shaking it briefly, her palm warm against the woman's cool, steady grip. "He is just finishing up," the woman added, gesturing toward a set of tall doors at the end of the hall, and Naomi followed her gaze, feeling something shift in her chest. Not fear exactly, but awareness, like standing at the edge of something that could change direction without warning. The doors opened before she reached them, and Ethan stepped out, his jacket perfectly aligned, his expression composed in that same controlled way she remembered. But when his eyes landed on her, there was that pause again, just a fraction longer this time, his gaze taking in the details, recalculating, and, for a moment, neither of them spoke, the hallway quiet around them, the distant city lights glowing through the windows behind him. "You came," he said finally, his voice lower than before, less dismissive, more grounded, and Naomi met his eyes without looking away, her answer simple, steady, carrying none of the hesitation she had left outside on the sidewalk. "I said I would," she replied, and the space between them held that truth for a second longer than expected, like something had shifted, not fully, not yet, but enough to be felt. "We are already late," Ethan said, not sharply, but with a quiet urgency that lived in the way he checked his watch rather than in his voice. And he stepped aside just enough for Naomi to walk beside him instead of behind him, a small adjustment that felt deliberate, though he did not acknowledge it. The hallway opened into a wide private dining room, where soft golden light replaced the cooler tones outside. Long windows stretching from floor to ceiling with the city glowing far below like a distant constellation, and a table set for 8 sat at the center, already occupied by figures dressed in tailored suits and polished confidence. Their conversations lowering just slightly as Ethan entered, their eyes shifting, measuring, noticing. "Ethan," a man at the head of the table said, his voice smooth, practiced, the kind that carried authority without needing volume. "We were beginning to think you changed your mind." And Ethan gave a brief nod, controlled, composed. "Traffic," he replied, simple, dismissive, before his hand moved, almost instinctively, toward Naomi's back, not touching, but guiding, placing her within the space beside him as if she belonged there. "This is Naomi," he said, the introduction minimal, and for a fraction of a second, the silence that followed felt heavier than the room itself, the kind of silence that did not come from absence of sound but from presence of judgment. Naomi felt it immediately, the shift in air, the subtle narrowing of eyes, the polite smiles that did not quite reach warmth, and she straightened just slightly, her hands relaxed at her sides, her breathing steady, refusing to shrink into the expectations quietly pressing against her. "Naomi," the man repeated, his gaze lingering a moment too long before offering a thin smile. "It is a pleasure," and she returned it with a calm nod. Likewise, her voice even, her tone carrying neither apology nor performance, just presence. They took their seats, Ethan beside her, the table stretching wide with glassware catching the light, silver utensils aligned with precision, and as the server began to pour water, the conversations resumed, but differently now, more careful, more pointed, questions sliding beneath the surface of casual remarks. "So Naomi," a woman across the table said, her tone light but edged with curiosity, "what do you do?" And the question hung there, simple on its face, but layered with assumption, expectation, a quiet test. Naomi glanced briefly at Ethan, not for permission, just acknowledgement, and when he did not intervene, did not redirect, she answered for herself. "I work in hospitality," she said, choosing the word carefully, watching the slight shift in their expressions, the way it did not fully satisfy their curiosity, and the woman tilted her head just slightly, pressing further without raising her voice. That must be interesting. And Naomi felt the space narrow again, the invisible line being drawn, the category being placed around her. Ethan remained still beside her, his posture unchanged, his gaze forward, as if observing rather than participating, and in that stillness, Naomi understood something clearly, not with anger, not yet, but with precision, that whatever this evening was meant to be, she was expected to fit into a shape that had already been decided. She reached for her glass, the cool surface grounding her fingers, and instead of retreating, she leaned just slightly into the moment, her voice steady, almost soft, but carrying enough to shift the air. "It is," she said, meeting the woman's eyes directly. "You learn very quickly who sees you and who does not." And for a brief second, the table went quiet again, not frozen, but altered, as if something unspoken had been placed gently in the center for everyone to notice. Ethan's gaze moved then, just a fraction, toward her, not fully turning, but enough that she caught it from the corner of her eye. That same pause returning, deeper this time, and outside the window, the city lights continued to flicker, distant and steady, while inside, something had begun to shift, subtle but undeniable, like a crack forming beneath a surface that had always seemed perfectly smooth. The conversation did not return to normal after that, even though voices resumed and glasses clinked again, because something subtle had shifted beneath the surface, like a note slightly out of tune that no one could ignore once they heard it. And Naomi could feel it in the way the questions came now, less casual, more deliberate, each one testing a boundary that had not been meant to move. Hospitality. The man at the head of the table repeated after a moment, his tone thoughtful but edged with something harder to place. "That requires a certain adaptability, does it not?" And the pause before the last word stretched just long enough to carry meaning beyond its surface. And Naomi set her glass down carefully, the faint click against the table sounding louder than it should have, her fingers steady even as the weight of the room pressed in. "It requires attention," she replied, her voice calm, measured, and respect for people, even when they do not offer it first. And this time the silence that followed was not as brief, not as easy to brush past, because the words had landed too cleanly, too precisely, and across from her. The woman who had asked earlier shifted slightly in her chair, her smile tightening just a fraction. Ethan remained still beside Naomi, but there was a change in the angle of his shoulders, a subtle tension that had not been there before, as if something in the exchange had reached him, unsettled the space he preferred to keep controlled, and for a second, his gaze dropped to the table, to the alignment of silverware, to anything that did not require immediate response. The server returned, placing plates down with quiet efficiency, the scent of seared salmon and roasted vegetables rising into the air, warm and inviting. But the appetite in the room felt restrained now, as if everyone was more focused on the undercurrent than the meal itself. "You speak as though you have experience with that," the man continued, not letting the moment pass, his tone still even, but sharper now, and Naomi met his eyes again, not with defiance, not with challenge, just clarity. "I do," she said simply, and she did not elaborate, did not soften it, because the truth did not need decoration. A faint exhale came from somewhere down the table, almost a laugh, but not quite, and Naomi felt it brush past her like a draft of cold air, familiar, expected, and still, she did not retreat. Beside her, Ethan shifted. Then, finally, his hand moving slightly on the table, fingers tapping once, a small, controlled motion that betrayed more than his expression did. And when he spoke, his voice was even, but lower than before. "Naomi is here with me," he said, not loudly, not forcefully, but enough to redirect the attention, enough to place a boundary without fully stepping into it. The words hung there, protective on the surface, but incomplete underneath, and Naomi felt the difference immediately. The way it shielded her just enough to maintain the image, but not enough to challenge the tone that had been set. She turned her head slightly toward him then, not fully, just enough to catch his profile, the line of his jaw set, his eyes forward again, composed, controlled. And in that moment, she understood something deeper, something that settled quietly but firmly. that he was not used to standing in discomfort, not when it risked the structure he had built around himself. Naomi leaned back slightly in her chair, her posture still relaxed, her expression unchanged, but inside, a decision began to form, not sudden, not dramatic, just steady, like something aligning into place. And as the conversation shifted again, moving into business, into numbers and projections and strategies that filled the air with language, designed to exclude as much as it included, she listened without interrupting, without inserting herself, because she no longer needed to prove her place at the table. She had already done that, and somewhere between the measured voices and the quiet clink of silverware, she realized that this evening was not about fitting into their world. It was about seeing it clearly and deciding what she was willing to accept from it, and what she was not. The rhythm of the room settled into something colder after that, not loud, not openly hostile, but sharpened in a way that made every word feel like it carried more weight than it should. And Naomi sat there, hands resting lightly near her plate, listening as numbers moved across the table like currency instead of conversation, projections spoken with quiet confidence, decisions framed as inevitabilities. And she noticed how easily people spoke when they assumed agreement, how little space was left for anything that did not fit the direction already chosen. Ethan's voice joined in, measured and precise, outlining a timeline, adjusting figures, his tone steady, controlled, the same tone he had used when he first spoke to her. But now she could hear something beneath it, a tension that had not been there before, like a thread pulled just slightly too tight. "We move forward next quarter," he said, his gaze fixed on the man across from him. "The expansion is already aligned with our projections." And the man nodded, but slowly, as if weighing something beyond the numbers. "Provided," he added, his eyes flicking briefly toward Naomi before returning to Ethan, "that the image remains consistent." And the word lingered in the air longer than it should have, quiet but pointed, and Naomi felt it land, not as surprise, but as confirmation, beside her. Ethan did not respond immediately, and in that pause, she could almost hear the calculation, the silent assessment of risk and outcome, the instinct to maintain control pressing against something less familiar, something less defined. Naomi reached for her water, the glass cool against her fingertips, grounding, and she took a slow sip, letting the moment unfold without stepping into it, because she already understood where it was going. "Of course," Ethan said finally, his voice even, but just slightly tighter than before. "Everything is under control." And the conversation moved on, just like that, redirected back into safer territory. But the shift remained, subtle and persistent, like a shadow that did not leave when the light changed. Naomi set her glass down carefully, her eyes moving across the table, taking in the small details now. The way the woman across from her avoided looking directly at her. The way the man at the head of the table adjusted his cufflinks as if resetting something. The way Ethan's hand remained still, no longer tapping, no longer moving, as if holding itself in place required effort. She leaned back slightly, her posture relaxed, but her mind clear, sharper than it had been when she first arrived, and she realized that this was the moment, not loud, not dramatic, but decisive in its own quiet way, the point where roles were being defined without being spoken. "You asked me to be here," she said suddenly, her voice calm but cutting cleanly through the layered conversation. And the table stilled again, not abruptly, but enough that every word that followed would be heard. Ethan turned his head toward her this time, fully, his expression controlled but alert, and for a second, the room seemed to narrow to just the space between them. Naomi met his gaze, steady, not challenging, just clear. "So I am here," she continued, her tone even. "But I am not something you manage." And the words did not rise, did not sharpen, they simply settled. Undeniable in their simplicity. No one spoke immediately after, the silence stretching just enough to carry the weight of what had been said. And Ethan's eyes held hers for a moment longer than expected, something shifting behind them, something that did not align with the version of control he had built so carefully. Outside, the city lights flickered against the glass, distant and constant, and inside, the balance of the room tilted, not visibly, not completely, but enough that nothing felt quite as stable as it had when the evening began. And in that quiet shift, Something within Ethan gave way. Not fully, not yet, but enough that the certainty he relied on no longer felt as solid as it once had. For a moment, no one spoke, and the silence that followed her words did not feel empty. It felt full, like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting to see who would move first, and Naomi did not look away, her eyes steady on Ethan's, not demanding, not pleading, just present in a way that made it impossible to pretend she was not there. Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a small shift that only someone watching closely would notice, and he leaned back slightly in his chair, exhaling through his nose as if resetting something inside himself. But the control he reached for did not settle as easily this time. "That is not what this is," he said finally, his voice lower, measured, but lacking the clean certainty it had carried earlier, and Naomi tilted her head just a fraction, not dismissive, just listening, as if giving him the space to hear his own words. Across the table, the man at the head cleared his throat softly, fingers steepled in front of him, eyes moving between them with quiet interest. "Ethan," he said, tone calm but edged with expectation, "we are discussing alignment." And the word landed again, heavier now, because it was no longer abstract. It was pointed, immediate, and Naomi felt the weight of it settle into the space between her and Ethan. Ethan glanced toward him, then back at Naomi, and for the first time that evening, there was hesitation in his gaze, not about the deal, not about the room, but about her, about what she represented. In a space that had never required him to question himself before, Naomi reached for her napkin, smoothing it lightly between her fingers, grounding herself in the small movement, and when she spoke again, her voice remained calm, but there was a quiet firmness beneath it. "You do not have to explain it to me," she said, her eyes steady. "I understand exactly what this is," and something in the way she said it shifted the air again, because there was no accusation in it, only clarity, and that made it harder to dismiss. The woman across the table shifted in her seat, her smile returning, but thinner now. "I think perhaps we are overcomplicating a simple evening," she said lightly, attempting to smooth the moment. But her gaze avoided Naomi as she spoke, landing instead on Ethan, as if expecting him to restore the balance. Ethan's hand moved again, a small motion against the table, fingers brushing the edge of his glass, and he looked down for a second, just one, before lifting his gaze back to Naomi. And in that brief drop, something gave way, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough that the version of himself he had been presenting no longer fit as cleanly. "Naomi," he said, her name quieter now, less like a role, more like a person, and the way he said it carried a different weight, one that did not belong to the room or the deal or the expectations surrounding them. She held his gaze, not softening, not hardening, just allowing the moment to exist without rushing it. And around them, the room remained still, conversations paused, attention narrowed, because whatever was happening now was no longer part of the script anyone had expected. "We should continue," the man at the head said after a moment, his tone controlled, but there was an edge beneath it now, impatience threaded with something sharper, and the conversation attempted to move forward again, numbers returning, projections filling the space, but the rhythm was broken, uneven, like a song that had lost its tempo. Naomi leaned back slightly, her hands resting calmly in her lap now, and she no longer felt the need to follow the flow of the discussion, because the truth had already been laid out in a way that could not be undone. And beside her, Ethan spoke when required, responded when addressed, but his focus no longer held the same sharp precision. It drifted, subtly, toward her, toward the space she occupied, toward the words she had left hanging in the air. And in that quiet shift, unnoticed by most but undeniable to him, the balance of power he had walked in with began to fracture, not in the room, not in the deal, but inside himself, where control had always been absolute, until now. The conversation never fully recovered its rhythm after that, even though voices resumed and the language of business filled the air again, because something quieter and more disruptive had taken hold, something that could not be smoothed over with numbers or polite transitions. And Naomi felt it in the way no one quite met her eyes for more than a second, in the way their attention circled around her presence instead of through it. She sat still, her posture relaxed, her hands folded lightly. no longer trying to follow every detail being discussed because she had already understood what mattered. And beside her, Ethan continued to speak when addressed, his tone controlled, his words precise. But there was a slight delay now, a fraction of a second before each response, as if he was hearing more than what was being said. "We will finalize the terms after review," he stated at one point, his gaze fixed on the documents in front of him. But his focus did not hold there. It shifted, almost involuntarily, toward Naomi again, and each time it did, something tightened in his expression, something unsettled. "You seem distracted," the man at the head of the table observed calmly, his voice cutting cleanly through the discussion, and Ethan looked up, the moment snapping back into place. "I am not," he replied, quick, controlled, but the denial felt thinner than it should have, and the man's eyes lingered on him for a second longer before moving on. Naomi noticed the exchange. Without turning her head, without reacting outwardly, but inside, the clarity she had found earlier deepened, settling into something steady, something that no longer needed validation, and she realized that whatever this evening had been meant to prove, it had already revealed more than intended. A server stepped in quietly, refilling glasses, adjusting plates, the small, practiced movements of someone used to being invisible, and for a brief second, Naomi's eyes followed him, noticing the way he moved around the table without interrupting, without being acknowledged, and something about that mirrored. Too closely, too sharply, to ignore. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice not loud, but enough to shift attention again, and this time, she did not wait for permission or acknowledgement. She simply rose from her chair, the fabric of her dress falling smoothly as she stood, her movements unhurried, deliberate, and the room stilled once more, not dramatically, but enough that her absence would be felt before it even happened. Ethan turned toward her immediately, his expression tightening. "Naomi," he said, her name carrying a different weight now, not commanding, not dismissive, but uncertain, and she met his gaze for a brief moment, just long enough for him to see that her decision was already made. "I think you have everything you need," she said quietly, her tone even, not cold, not warm, just final in a way that did not invite negotiation, and the words settled between them with a calm certainty that made them heavier than if she had raised her voice. No one at the table interrupted, no one offered a response, because there was nothing in her tone that suggested this was a moment open for discussion, and as she turned, stepping away from the table, her heels soft against the carpet, the space she left behind felt larger than it should have, as if something essential had shifted out of place. Ethan did not move at first, his hand resting against the edge of the table, fingers still, his gaze following her as she walked toward the doors, and for the first time that evening, the control he relied on did not come back when he reached for it. It stayed just out of reach, replaced by something unfamiliar, something that felt less like certainty and more like loss. The door closed behind her with a soft, almost silent click, and the room remained still for a second longer than expected, the weight of her absence settling into the air, and then the man at the head of the table leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "Shall we continue?" he said, as if nothing had changed, but Ethan did not answer immediately, because for the first time in a long time, continuing felt like the wrong direction, and he could not ignore it. The door had barely settled into its frame when the silence inside the room began to press in from all sides, heavier now, less controlled, and Ethan remained still in his chair, his hand still resting on the table where it had been when Naomi stood, his fingers unmoving as if any motion might confirm something he was not ready to accept. Across from him, the man at the head of the table watched with a measured expression, his posture unchanged, but his eyes sharper now, more attentive. "Ethan," he said after a moment, his tone calm but carrying a quiet edge, "we are waiting," and the words were simple, but they landed with expectation, with pressure, with the weight of everything that had been carefully arranged leading up to this evening. Ethan inhaled slowly, the breath controlled, deliberate, and he nodded once, as if returning to something familiar, something structured. "Yes," he replied, his voice steady, but not as firm as before. "Let us continue." And the conversation resumed, numbers sliding back into place, voices regaining their rhythm, but for Ethan, the words no longer held the same clarity. They felt distant, like something happening behind glass. He tried to focus, to follow the projections, to engage in the strategy being laid out. But each sentence seemed to echo against the image of Naomi standing, the way she had not raised her voice, the way she had not asked for anything, and still managed to shift the entire room. Your margins will hold if the rollout stays on schedule, someone said, pointing to a document, and Ethan nodded automatically, his eyes scanning the page without truly seeing it, because his attention kept pulling back to the moment she walked away, to the absence she left behind, to the space that felt unexpectedly hollow. Ethan, the man at the head said again, more directly this time, and Ethan looked up, the moment snapping into place once more. Are you aligned with the final terms? He asked, his gaze steady, searching, and for a second, Ethan did not answer, because the question no longer felt as simple as it had an hour ago. His eyes shifted, almost instinctively, toward the door Naomi had walked through, as if expecting it to open again, as if expecting her to return and reset something that had been unsettled, but it remained closed, silent, unchanged. I am reviewing them, Ethan said finally, his voice measured, buying himself time he had never needed before, and the man leaned back slightly, studying him. That is not how you usually respond, he said, not accusing, just observing, and Ethan felt that land more sharply than any direct challenge, because it was true. He was not responding the way he always did, not with certainty, not with control, and the realization settled into him with quiet discomfort. The conversation moved forward again, but now there was a subtle shift in how he was being perceived, a slight recalibration of expectations, and Ethan felt it. The way the room adjusted around hesitation, the way confidence was measured in real time. Minutes passed, or maybe longer, time stretching in a way that made it difficult to track, and finally, Ethan set his pen down, the soft click against the table louder than it should have been, and he exhaled slowly, the breath steady but carrying weight. We will finalize this tomorrow, he said, his tone calm, but final in a way that did not invite debate, and the man at the head of the table raised an eyebrow slightly. Tomorrow? He repeated, and Ethan nodded once, his gaze steady now, but different, less about control, more about decision. Yes, he said. Tomorrow. And without waiting for further response, he pushed his chair back and stood, the movement smooth but carrying a quiet urgency beneath it. And as he turned toward the door, the room behind him remained still for a fraction longer than expected. The shift now undeniable, because for the first time, Ethan Cole was the one walking away from something that had been carefully set in front of him, and he did not fully understand why. Only that staying felt like the wrong choice, and that feeling was something he could not ignore. The hallway outside the private dining room felt different the moment the door closed behind him, quieter, wider, as if the air itself had shifted away from expectation and into something more uncertain, and Ethan's steps slowed for the first time that night. The urgency that had pushed him out of the room losing its direction now that he was alone with it. The soft carpet muted his movement, but he could still hear the echo of his own thoughts, replaying fragments of the evening in a way he could not control. The way Naomi had stood, the way she had spoken without raising her voice, the way she had walked away without looking back, and none of it fit into the structure he had spent years perfecting. He reached the elevator and pressed the button, his finger lingering against the cool metal a second longer than necessary, and when the doors opened, the empty space inside reflected his image back at him, composed, intact, exactly as it had been when the night began. And yet something in that reflection felt incomplete, like a version of himself that no longer aligned with what he had just experienced. The ride down was silent except for the low mechanical hum, the numbers descending one by one, and Ethan leaned back slightly, his shoulders loosening in a way they had not all evening, as if the absence of the room had removed something invisible but heavy. He exhaled slowly, running a hand across his jaw, and for a moment, he closed his eyes, not to rest, but to steady the thoughts that kept circling back to the same point, the same realization he had been avoiding, that he had let the moment pass without stepping into it, that he had chosen control over clarity, and that choice now sat with him in a way he could not ignore. When the doors opened into the lobby, the space was nearly empty, the polished floors reflecting the dimmed lights, the quiet presence of the front desk attendant barely noticeable, and Ethan stepped out, his pace slower now, less defined, as if he was no longer moving toward something, but trying to understand where he had already been. Outside, the night air hit him immediately, cooler than before, carrying the distant sounds of traffic and the low rhythm of the city continuing without pause. And he paused just beyond the entrance, his gaze scanning the street, not for anything specific at first, just taking in the movement, the passing cars, the flicker of headlights, the steady flow of people who had no idea what had shifted inside him. Then his eyes focused, narrowing slightly as he looked toward the corner, where the streetlights cast longer shadows, where the sidewalk opened into the direction leading away from the building. And he realized he did not know which way Naomi had gone, did not know if she had taken a car, a bus, or simply walked until the space behind her no longer mattered. The uncertainty unsettled him more than he expected, because he was used to knowing, used to having information, control, direction, and this felt different. This felt like something slipping beyond his reach. He took a step forward, then another, his movement no longer calculated, just instinctive, following a pull he could not fully explain, and as he reached the edge of the sidewalk, he stopped again. The city stretching out in front of him, open, unpredictable, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan Cole did not have a clear answer, did not have a defined next move, only a quiet, persistent thought that refused to settle, that maybe the most important decision he had avoided tonight was not the deal he left behind, but the moment he had failed to stand up when it mattered, and that realization stayed with him as the night moved around him, steady and indifferent, while he stood there, no longer certain of the man he had been just a few hours ago. He did not move for a while, not because he could not, but because every direction felt incomplete, like stepping forward without understanding what he was stepping into. And the city continued around him, indifferent, headlights passing, voices fading in and out, the distant rhythm of traffic steady against the quiet shift happening inside him. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly, his breath visible in the cool air, and for the first time, he did not reach for his phone, did not check messages, did not fall back into the routine that usually anchored him, because none of that felt relevant now, not after the way Naomi had looked at him, not after the way she had left. He turned slightly, his gaze tracing the direction she might have taken, replaying the moment in his mind, not as a sequence of events, but as a series of choices, each one clearer now in hindsight, each one revealing something he had chosen not to see when it mattered. You do not need a date. You need courage. The words returned, not loud, not accusing, just present, and they settled deeper this time, because he could no longer dismiss them as observation. They felt like truth. He took a step forward, then another, his movement no longer driven by urgency, but by something steadier, something that did not demand speed, only direction. And as he walked, he realized that he did know where to go, not because she had told him, but because he remembered. The restaurant, the quiet corner where she had stood with that same calm presence, the place where he had first reduced her to a solution, and the realization landed with a weight that made his steps slow again, just slightly. The distance was not far by car, but he chose to walk, the rhythm of his steps grounding him in a way he had not expected, each block passing under the glow of streetlights, the city shifting gradually from polished towers to narrower streets, from quiet luxury to something more lived in, more real, and with each change, the contrast became clearer, not just in the environment, but in himself, in the way he had moved between these worlds without ever questioning the space between them. When he reached the restaurant, the lights inside were dimmer than before, the rush long gone, only a few tables occupied, and he paused outside for a second, looking through the glass, half expecting not to see her, half uncertain what he would say if he did. He pushed the door open, the familiar scent of lemon cleaner and warm food meeting him immediately, and for a moment, everything felt exactly as it had earlier, the same polished surfaces, the same quiet hum, but he knew it was not the same, because he was not. Naomi stood near the back, wiping down a table, her movement steady, unhurried, and when she looked up, their eyes met almost instantly, as if she had felt his presence before seeing him, and there was no surprise in her expression, no confusion, just a calm awareness that settled into the space between them. Ethan stopped a few feet away, the words he had prepared dissolving before they could form, because standing there, in front of her, without the structure of a deal or the shield of expectation, felt entirely different. And for the first time, he did not try to control that feeling. He simply let it exist. "I should have said something," he said finally, his voice quieter than it had ever been around her, stripped of the sharp edges it once carried. And the admission did not feel like a strategy. It felt like truth, simple and unprotected. And Naomi watched him for a moment, her expression unchanged, but her eyes searching, not for perfection, not for apology, but for something real, something that could not be performed. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was waiting, giving space for what came next to matter. Naomi did not answer right away, and the quiet between them stretched just long enough to make his words settle into something real, instead of something said too quickly. Her hands still resting on the edge of the table she had been cleaning, the cloth folded neatly between her fingers as she studied him with a calm that did not rush to accept or reject what he had offered. "You should have," she said finally, her voice soft but steady. Not accusing, not forgiving, just honest in a way that left no room for interpretation, and Ethan nodded once. The movement small but deliberate, because there was nothing to argue with in that truth. The low hum of the restaurant filled the space around them, a distant clink of dishes from the kitchen, the faint buzz of overhead lights, and for a moment, it felt like the world had narrowed down to just this conversation, stripped of everything else that had complicated it earlier. "I thought," Ethan started, then paused, his gaze dropping briefly to the table before lifting again, and for the first time, he did not try to finish the sentence quickly, did not try to shape it into something controlled. "I thought keeping things smooth would fix it," he admitted, his voice quieter now, more grounded. But it did not, and Naomi watched him carefully, her expression unchanged, but there was a shift in her eyes, something that acknowledged the effort without fully accepting it yet. "It never does," she replied, setting the cloth down and straightening slightly, her posture relaxed but firm. "Because smooth is not the same as right." And the words settled between them with a clarity that felt heavier than anything said earlier that night. Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing just a fraction, not because the weight had lifted, but because he was no longer trying to carry it the same way, and he glanced around the restaurant, taking in the simple details he had ignored before, the worn edges of the tables, the quiet rhythm of people finishing their shifts, the space that felt grounded in a way his world rarely did. "I walked away from the deal," he said after a moment, not as a declaration, but as a fact he was still processing, and Naomi's gaze sharpened slightly, not surprised, but attentive. "That was not because of me," she said, her tone even, and Ethan shook his head once. "No," he replied. "It was because I finally heard what you were saying," and the admission hung there, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just real in a way that did not need emphasis. Naomi leaned back against the edge of the table, her arms folding loosely, her eyes still on him, measuring not his words, but the space behind them, the consistency, the intent, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the silence itself was doing something important. It was allowing the shift to exist without being forced. "You cannot undo what happened," she said eventually, her voice calm, steady. "And you cannot expect one moment to change everything." And Ethan nodded, the truth, landing without resistance this time. "I know," he said, and there was no defense in it, no attempt to negotiate, just acceptance. Naomi studied him for another second, then glanced down at the table beside her, her fingers brushing lightly against the surface before she looked back up, and something in her expression softened, not completely, not fully, but enough to let a different possibility exist. "But you came back," she added quietly, and the words were not praise, they were recognition. Simple and unembellished, and Ethan felt that more than anything else she had said, because it acknowledged the choice he had made without turning it into something it was not. He held her gaze, not trying to fill the space this time, not trying to control where it went, just present in it. And for the first time that night, the tension between them shifted into something quieter, something less about conflict and more about understanding. Not complete, not resolved, but real enough to continue. The moment lingered without urgency. The the quiet between them no longer heavy but settled, like something that had found its place without needing to be forced. And Naomi picked up the cloth again, not to end the conversation, but to continue the rhythm of her world, the small, steady motions that had always grounded her, her fingers moving across the table in slow, even strokes while her eyes occasionally lifted to meet his. Ethan did not step closer right away, did not reach for words that might rush what had already taken shape. He simply stood there, taking in the space as it was, the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter, the faint scent of soap and warm food lingering in the air, the simplicity of it all standing in quiet contrast to everything he had left behind earlier that night. "I do not expect anything," he said after a moment, his voice calm, not trying to persuade, not trying to promise more than he understood. "I just did not want to leave it the way I did." And Naomi nodded slightly, her gaze lowering briefly before returning to him, not distant, not guarded, just thoughtful, as if weighing the space between what had been and what could be. "Most people do," she replied softly, finishing the last edge of the table before setting the cloth aside again, her hands now free, resting lightly against the surface. "They leave things unfinished and call it closure." And there was no bitterness in her tone, only a quiet recognition of something she had seen before, something she had learned not to expect differently. Ethan absorbed that without defense, his shoulders relaxing just a fraction more, because he was no longer trying to stand above the moment, he was standing within it, and that difference changed the way everything felt. A chair scraped softly somewhere behind the counter, a co-worker moving through the final tasks of the night, and Naomi glanced in that direction for a second before looking back at him, her expression softer now, not fully open, but no longer closed. "So what happens now?" she asked, the question simple, but carrying more than it seemed, not demanding an answer, just placing the possibility in front of him. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze steady on hers, and for the first time, he did not try to calculate the right response, did not search for the version of the future that would fit best into his world. He let the uncertainty remain, because it felt more honest than anything else. "I do not know," he admitted, and there was no hesitation in it, no discomfort, just truth. "But I would like to try again," and the words settled into the space between them, not as a grand gesture, not as a promise, but as something quieter, something that left room for both of them to decide what it meant. Naomi held his gaze, the corners of her expression shifting just slightly, not quite a smile, not quite something else, but warmer than before, and she stepped away from the table, closing the small distance between them by a single step, enough to change the space, not enough to rush it. "Then do not pretend this time," she said gently, her voice carrying the same calm strength it had from the beginning, but now without the edge, without the need to defend it. "Just show up." And Ethan nodded once, the movement simple, but grounded in a way that felt different from anything he had done earlier that night. Outside, the streetlights cast a soft glow through the glass, the city continuing its quiet rhythm, and inside, nothing dramatic happened, no sudden resolution, no sweeping change, just two people standing in a space that felt more real than anything that had come before, the air steady, the silence no longer uncertain. And as Ethan turned to leave, not walking away this time, but stepping into something he did not yet understand, Naomi watched him for a moment before returning to her work, the cloth moving across the table in the same steady rhythm, the same quiet presence, because she had not changed the world that night. She had changed something small.